blue Pullman, perhaps the finest product to appear in a Triang catalogue. Autumn 1963 was its first appearance in the 9th edition. That's the one featuring a Terence Cuneo painting. He was dispatched here to Saltash in Cornwall to paint the Tamar Bridge. Class 40s no longer pass over and the semaphore signal has gone. But to go to these lengths symbolises the standard set by Triang and probably gives one indication of why 12 months later, Triang Hornby would emerge as a market leader for the next 7 years. The Triang Hornby High Mech. In the first half of the 60s, Triang didn't have it all their own way. There was competition from Meccano's Hornby 002 rail, and they were still supporting their much older 3-rail system. Trix were producing die-cast models and had just moved into plastic and a finer scale. Graham Farish had their 00 gauge models. Their Pullmans were particularly fine. And on the accessory front, things were very buoyant. Master models had an expanding metal range of both figures and buildings, and Merit produced a fine range of plastic accessories, both large and small. And if you wanted to assemble yourself, then Airfix couldn't be beaten. 00 Dinkies were delightful, but the much greater range from the first series of Matchbox toys adorned many a layout. And all of those are here on this layout. What a nostalgic sight. Locomotives and rolling stock from Triang Hornby and accessories from just about everybody else. A big 60s train set. More of that later, but this Hornby 00 signal changing to red symbolises the end of an era. In February 1964, Lines Brothers were invited to take over the failing Meccano empire. Mike Foster, a lifelong Hornby 00 enthusiast and author of the definitive work on the subject, believes their past was the problem.
They were living on the hype and success they'd had from the 1950s when they launched the Bristol Castle, the 8F, and then became their modernisation plan. And so, slowly but surely, their stockrooms built up and built up and built up. And they went selling their manufacturing output. But say Meccano would have 50,000 products in stock and would only sell 5,000 in a year. Clearly it was a recipe for a disaster.
I'm just going to wind this one up and then we'll launch it off. You can do the brake guy. Okay, pull that one out a bit further. Right up. Whoops.
Richard Lynes, the architect of Triang, still enjoys his train set. Long before the Meccano collapse, he kept watch on the competition.
During the time we were trying to develop the train set into a model railway system or a more elaborate system, I used to go shopping and buy Hornby 00 bits and pieces and all the catalogues in order to see what we were up against, and I did the same with Tricks, and there were one or two other brands. I think Graham Farish were floating around as well. And we looked at all these and weighed them up and looked at the prices, and then we used to meet their staff at the various toy fairs where they had a display and we did, and there was a fair amount of leg pulling went on. And I think I remember one of them saying that he actually admitting to us that he was finding more red boxes in the shops than there were blue ones, which we thought was rather good news.
In the 12 months up to the amalgamation, Triang continued their advertising, taking up this regular series of full-page advertisements covering a very wide range of products, mainly accessories. In the June 1965 Railway Modeler, this was the last Triang advert. In July, it was Triang Hornby, though with little emphasis on the change. That came in September, when this advert proclaimed the new status. Today, amongst collectors, the collapse of Hornby 00 is seen to be a turning point for the hobby, and this leaflet commands a very high price. But only a year or two before the takeover, acquiring Hornby 00 was not a priority for Richard Lynes.
We weren't really considering the toppling Meccano. We were just chipping away and trying to make more money for ourselves. There was, I think, also at the time, both of us were being badgered into making more realistic models. I didn't necessarily disagree with making more realistic models, but I didn't want them to become too expensive. This was the danger, that if you make all your models too expensive, then you reduce the size of your market. And I was very conscious of that.
Researching amongst the magazines of the time doesn't seem to reflect too much concern. The most formal reference was in Model Railway Constructor in April 1964. This editorial was thoughtful and realistic, and the final sentence pointed to the future.
We can only hope that the experience of Meccano, coupled with the progressive outlook of the Lynes Brothers Group, will produce models of an even higher standard, which will satisfy the ever-critical eye of the enthusiast and further enhance the name of British models overseas.
A party of us went up to the Liverpool to see around the factory. 4 or 5 of us, I think. It was rather a sad sight. A lot of it was empty, and I think they just sold the boardroom table because they were short of money, and that was rather sad. The place where they made trains was virtually empty, except for finished stock. There was no work going on at all, that I can remember, which was actually rather beneficial, because I had imagined that we were going to have to close it down, but it had already closed, so that wasn't a problem that we had to face up to.
The amalgamation leaflet hints at a continued availability of Hornby 00, and the locomotives and accessories illustrated seem to make this clear. However, Richard Lynes reveals a different story.
We had to try and keep a pretense at there being a Hornby element in the Triang range in order not to alienate all Hornby customers. And this was going to be rather difficult, and in point of fact we discovered when we got there that there were stocks of quite a lot of items which we would therefore take over and rechristen as Triang Hornby. I think the West Country locomotive, Barnstable, was one of them. And the reason, it was a good model, but I think it was rather expensive. There was also some of those dreadful Kobo diesels that looked frightful, and I don't think they worked terribly well. And there were some stations, quite a lot of stations, which went well with our own stations. They were different styles, so it was a good thing. But it wasn't a very difficult decision. It was basically whatever was in stock we took on.
The M7 and a DMU simultaneously depart. Peter Oliver and Nigel Evans are retired Rovex employees, joining the company just after the amalgamation. They both have memories of the arrival of Hornby 00 stock in Margate.
One year on a shutdown, I spent nearly all my wages on the breakdown set and a nice goods set. And then, obviously, later on in the year, we had quite stocks, and there was a certain gentleman, Mr. Murphy, who was the service manager. And I went downstairs one day, and he showed me a beautiful Barnstable locomotive, and he put it right up to my face and said, I bet you'd like one of these, Peter, wouldn't you? I said, cool, yes, please. And he just dropped it on the floor and smashed it, and then just moved over, picked me another one off the shelf and says, well, there you are, there's another one. I could have been a millionaire because we had all the 00 stuff here.
We had stocks of finished goods arrive at Margate, and we had to tool up for 2 converter items of rolling stock so that it became compatible with Triang Railways. Eventually, after some time, it was decided to put this product range, separate the product range and put it to a company called G&R Wrenn under the Triang Wrenn name, and for 3 or 4 years it was produced by them and taken over completely by them and distributed from Basildon.
Filmed at a Triang Society event, this is Dave Coddington's Triang Hornby layout. With a rich assortment of products, it's impressive indeed. Not often seen, this range of starter set locomotives and rolling stock. This is one of a series of events organised by Triang collectors intended to highlight all the Triang products. Obviously, not just trains. Displaying a collection of Australian Triang, Pat Hammond, author of the two major works on Triang and Triang Hornby. Earlier, he gave his thoughts on the outcome if Hornby 00 had not been taken over.
Hornby 00 would have taken a route very similar to Triang. They'd have gone over purely to plastic mouldings, but they'd have aimed at a higher quality. And we'd have seen a complete set of plastic coaches, for example, but we'd have seen a bigger range than Triang did. And I suspect that what happened when mainline and airfix entered the field 10 years later would have happened in the mid-60s.
And now to complete the amalgamation analysis, what does Mike Foster think could have saved Hornby 00?
But what would have saved the company? Perhaps, like Hornby today, maybe making shorter production runs, maybe increasing the prices. And also Meccano left it far too late, really, to come into two-rail. They continued their three-rail, despite the many enthusiasts following just the three-rail. I think for far too long. And certainly Triang and Rovex and Triang Hornby in the early 1950s gained the advantage of their less expensive lines and the more realistic two-rail operation.
Not quite fitting in, but nevertheless part of the Triang Hornby range. Well, this Bedford bus is arriving at the home of that last layout. This is Station X, or Bletchley Park, the home of the wartime decoders and the Enigma machine. These are the huts in which Alan Turing and his colleagues broke the German codes. Today, they're part of a museum complex in which Milton Keynes Model Railway Society is housed and open to the public. This is one of their scale layouts currently under construction and destined for the exhibition circuit. But they also acknowledge their hobby's heritage. There's a fine Trix twin layout with a blend of British and foreign stock. Hornby 003 rail is represented by this extensive layout, rich in period accessories and full of busy train movements. There's also O-gauge, and in the background, Dennis Lovett, the owner of the Triang Hornby layout seen a few moments ago.
Somehow the desire to recreate something from my childhood evolved, but none of this is mint and boxed. It's all come from other sources. It's been put together. Sometimes out of 3 locos we've made a good one, Some of them have come in painted in Dulux and have had body changes. We've had new chassis put onto them. So rather than mint and boxed, I think old and knackered is probably the best description for a lot of the things that you see on this layout. Of course, starting with a Triang layout led to other things, and I did have quite a serious spell of railway modelling, taking some very nice layouts out around the country. But I came back to the Triang, and it's great fun, and we probably had more interest in this layout going around exhibitions than I ever did with the serious trains.
Well now, we must let the story move forwards, using the catalogues as our guides to new products. Though, as collectors know, the actual dates when models were in the shops can be quite different. 1965 will therefore be our first, even though it's labelled Triang, and the rest follow like this. For a long time, the illustrations had the appearance of drawings, only later becoming actual photographs. Dave Stone, a former draftsman, now a Hornby designer, recalls the background to these illustrations.
Another thing that might be of interest to you is that when I first came here, there was a girl called Maggie Beach, who was an artist, who actually sat at a drawing board with her pencils, watercolours, and she actually painted these things by hand for the catalogue. All that was actually done on a board, and then they actually went away and they photographed them and brought them up to catalogue.
So in the 11th edition, the word new was attached to R342, the car transporter with 6 Minic cars, and R751, the English electric Type 3 diesel. On the same page was E3001. This started life as E3002 with Hornby 00 and is a pretty rare model. Rovex took the mould and modified it. They put in a different chassis and changed the roof switch. So how does it compare with the real thing? Well, we tracked down E3003 at Barrow Hill near Chesterfield and gave the model to an expert.
I think Triang did a very good job of the AL1 as was in 1960. Looking at it, the proportions of it are excellent. The standard of detail for a 40-year-old model is very impressive. The 2 pantographs was as the loco would have been set up in 1959, 1960. The later model captures the single pantograph. The original role of the second pantograph was due to lack of understanding of how the pantographs would behave in either leading or trailing on the locomotive. Both models capture the detail on the line and wheel crest particularly well. Again, is an excellent piece of printing for that time. One of the things we haven't found on the roof of ours yet is this strange switch that I understand allows you to switch between pantograph and track. We'll have to keep looking for that. This locomotive, E3003, follows on from E3001 and 3002 in the Triang Hornby 00 sequence. Was introduced to Longsight in February 1960. Survived until October 1990, working out of Willesden Depot in London on empty carriage duties in and out of Euston Station. The AC Locomotive Group acquired it from Pete Waterman, along with the other locomotives in our collection, in 1997, and shortly afterwards we brought them here to Barrow Hill.
This is the 18th century fort at Felixstowe, overlooking the Orwell estuary. And this is George Buckland, who was a sales rep for Triang Hornby, but just before joining in 1966, he had actually been interviewed by Meccano for a similar job. He asked them this question.
Being George Buckland, I was a bit naughty possibly in the interview and said to the sales manager, do you get much competition with Triang Railways on the one hand and corgi cars in the other? Well, said one of the sales managers, if you look at the product, there's no comparison. Well, of course, within a short time, Hornby had 2 rail, and they brought dinky toys out with windows and opening doors, which they'd scoffed at before.
A glance back at the old catalogues soon brought back memories for George. He was the face of Triang Hornby for the dealers, and he easily recalled what sold well.
What, of course, was always very popular were the battle space range, which really, not really strict railway models, but satisfied the younger people for something novel and kept their interest in model railways from that angle. And the particular example was the exploding car. I suppose that and the helicopter car and the rocket wagons were the most popular of the lot.
The period 64 to 71 was rather an odd period. We did some strange things, one of which would be the Battle Space series. We'd originally got into action accessories because of a cooperation we had with Lionel in America, and they'd in fact invented the helicopter cars and giraffe cars, and all we were doing was replicating them in England. And in fact they were very successful. They were good toys. But unfortunately we had a rather nutty marketing manager who wanted to turn them all into something more warlike and invented this battle space where all the products were made in khaki or some non-toy-like colour, and it was all rather zip-zwang. And sometimes you get away with it, but it's not the sort of thing that lasts, and you finish up with a lot of dead stock, and so I wish we'd never done it.
Wow, was Battle Space ever that exciting? Well, it certainly achieved its aim of having play value. We're now, of course, looking at the 12th edition catalogue and another Cuneo cover picture. Inside, the release of the Minic, and quoting the text, the model emphasises the attractive lines of this modern workhorse. Also for Great Western fans, the Albert Hall. And 2 Hornby 00 locomotives are included, Barnstaple and the Cobo. But really interesting, it's pages 21 with the 00 buildings and 20 with the Architects ultra-modern station. Architects was just a little like Baco, which incidentally was manufactured by Meccano. You built up a skeleton of vertical rods and then slotted in bricks and windows. With Architects, you built up a girder structure and then slotted in walls, windows, floors, doors, staircases, and eventually topped off with a roof. The whole thing is perfect 60s architecture. This is a little like the ultra-modern station, and this is the Railway Design Office, 2 of the 3 suggested buildings. Architects was made in the Spot On factory in Belfast, and you may come across these sets which were made from 00 gauge, but never actually shown in the Triang Hornby catalogues. And finally, for this catalogue, 2 other still lingering X00 products. The double-track tunnel and the plastic girder bridge, easily identified by its lightness, unpainted base and a strong red finish. These 2 are the metal ones, and the colour difference can be seen. New for 1967 and featured on the cover, another Cuneo picture. This time, the new M7. With its very stylish outline, it pleased the southern enthusiasts. The opening smokebox door was an innovation, and so was the glowing firebox, generally a suitable model for branch line work. The year also saw the liner trains, a range that was to become quite large, and today the same moulds are still in use. But then they were the latest thing in rolling stock development and looked pretty good. The Flying Scotsman, the big one for 1968, and the 14th edition catalogue. But was it? These images give a clue to what was really happening. The logo had acquired Minic, and 13 pages were devoted to what had been Minic motorways, and was now Triang Minic. It was in 1961 when Minic motorways had started, and slowly developed a good customer base. This is Dave Lyon operating his combined road rail layout at a Train Collectors Society exhibition.
I'm often described as a novelty item when I come and do exhibitions. Some people might take offence to that, but I'm rather quite flattered in a way. You have to realise that a lot of the models are now almost 40 years old. So we are dealing with quite old technology, and yet when you can see the vehicles moving in the background here, they are moving, they're moving well. Okay, they do stop from time to time, and they each have their own sort of little idiosyncrasies. But the fact that the range itself is so diverse, there were 41 different numbered models in the catalogues, although some of them were repeated with different chassis and different colours, etc. Okay, I've got some of the more rarer models here. If I can just take you through each one in turn. First of all, we've got a steam wagon here. This was produced in two different models. This is the earlier one. As you can see, it's got the metal chassis on the bottom with the gimbal wheel. The next one is the Conqueror tank. Again, it's an early model. You can see it's got the metal chassis. This one's got a double reduction gear on it, which means it runs quite slowly, but it also means that it runs very reliably.
Peter Bing was a designer and model maker for Minic in their Canterbury factory. Many of today's prized models started life in his imagination. So, how does an idea come to fruition?
You do a small drawing to this scale, which is 1/76, and you end up making a model like that. This is made out of wood. We used to hand carve them all from a block of lime, and I used to allow myself about a week's work to carve that out in wood, and a day's work to make these accessories like the bumpers and the headlights, because they used to be sent away to be plated. This is the pattern for that A40, and that's what the tool maker would get to cut the metal to make the actual moulding, so they could make tens of thousands of them off. So that is an exact copy of that pattern, 1/5 its size. This had to be accurate, and it actually, when it was finished, it was like glass. Whatever discrepancy was on there would come off on the die sinking. So it had to be polished up just like a finished vehicle.
So that's the history of the A40. Again, carved in lime by Peter. These are some prototypes that made it. and some that didn't.
Is this an illustration from a Triang Hornby catalogue? No, it's not. It's actually the cover of a Boys' World Annual 1967. And yet, both the cover and many of the articles inside seem to be influenced by the products of the Linesbros companies. On the cover we see battle space and a dinky lorry. Inside, the many others such as Scalextric and model railways. The question is, did Linesbros influence this? Did they contribute towards the cost of the publication?
Well, if Pat Hammond doesn't know, who will? Here's just a selection of illustrations from the annual to prove his point. Also published at this time, The Book of Trains, a tradition started in 1925 by the original Hornby Company. Apparently written by no less a person than O.S. Nock, it was a mixture of railway articles and a shortened catalogue, with much of the artwork being used for the following year's catalogue. And finally, those Cuneo paintings had another lease of life, being used on 3 jigsaws, though not under the Triang Hornby name. Right. Now back to that 1968 catalogue and these smart blue and grey coaches, including the new Mark IIs, complete with internal lighting. Another first. The accurate outline of the new Mark II coaches, beautifully modelled by Triang Hornby. A surprising reappearance in this catalogue was 2 transcontinental locomotives and a couple of coaches. Not new models, but earlier bodies now in a Canadian national livery. This was probably a way of selling excess stock no longer for export. But what a colourful sight the export and transcontinental range made.
the States was very, very little Triang Hornby or anything of the British-made trains. But I found out that there had been some Triang Hornby made by Triang for export to the US, and it was made for a company called ATT. It was American Trains and Track, I think they called themselves, Track and Trains. And the company had sold it in the US in the late 60s and very early 70s. And I started to find it at various swap meets, as we call them in the States, that we used to go to, like train shows in the UK, and started to buy it. And I started finding not only for myself, but other friends in the UK who said, oh, where did this stuff come from? And it was actually Triang Hornby, made in the UK, exported, but it was labeled for American railroads, as we call them over there, as opposed to railways. And you had Santa Fe, you had Chesapeake in Ohio, and you had various American names. And the strange thing about it was the actual quality of the trains themselves were well up to the American equivalent at the time. In fact, a lot of it was better. So it's been difficult to find because a lot of people actually still use it.
Into 1969 now, with this very uninspiring 15th edition catalogue cover, distracting the customer from some very appealing new models. Locomotives were beginning to appear in both modern and older liveries, but the inside cover revealed the Freightliner crane. This cleverly designed model could be lowered onto a container, grip and lift it, and then move it over to another track. Plenty of play value here. The motor rail had similar value. Initially with 16 cars, but later 12, the two wagons were very cleverly articulated over a common bogie. When run as a rake, they looked pretty impressive, and seen in close-up, the effect is quite convincing. The CKD kits were still being marketed for locomotives such as the Princess Elizabeth. Several coaches were also available, and introduced into this catalogue, the crane and match truck. The former Hornby 00 terminal station received some small colour changes. This is the kit as sold, and now it has two changes. A maroon to the building, and the platforms have a grey finish with white edges. But still Hornby 00 is acknowledged in the moulding. This is the extension kit in a rather anonymous white box, and like the 00 version, very rare. Almost unnoticed in the locomotive section, the blue Pullman turns grey and perhaps even more impressive, though it did lose its flush windows. Street sounds appropriate to model land, still with a presence in the catalogue. These self-coloured plastic building kits first appeared as real estate in 1962. They were not very attractively packaged, and by this time the range was dwindling as compared with the days when this leaflet was produced. They are perfect period pieces and reflect the architecture of the time. Back in the 1964 catalogue, the range had #1 place inside the cover with the first 5 pages. But there were many ambitious plans that came to nothing. The gas holder, the Georgian house, and the multiple store are just 3 examples. But wait a moment.
Having been influenced by the Triang catalogues during the mid-60s, I've undertaken the task of recreating 3 models which were actually not released under their intended formats. The first model I featured on here is the RML 46. It's a Mon shop with office block. Here we can see it's a double-fronted shop with additional windows, 3 stories. I've incorporated model and doors into this, which I've heavily modified. The second kit featured is the Georgian house. Again, this was not produced, as there weren't enough orders featured in the catalogue and required. Again, like the previous model, it doesn't actually feature any common parts utilised in any of the other kits, hence the cost of the tooling would have been too expensive as there weren't sufficient orders. One of the most unusual kits that was intended for production was the model and gasometer. It shares no common parts with any of the other kits again. I've utilised Triang trolley units as featured on the station sets for the top runners. One of the things that was particularly difficult in producing this model was actually trying to build the girders around the sides, vertical and horizontal, as they were totally scratch built and nobody could supply them pre-made. The model itself took probably in the region of about 100 hours to produce.
We must mention the pylon kit. It was based on the one outside the Triang factory and still stands today, perhaps visited by collectors and destined to receive a brass plaque. Incidentally, they were exported under the ATT brand and sold in this packaging in America, though the remainder of the range would have been inappropriate for export.
The Model Lounge range lasted for a very long time, and I think it was really ousted by foreign imports in the end of similar kits. As far as battle space was concerned, that had been extremely successful. It really does belong to the Triang Hornby era, although there had been military vehicles before that. But it came out in 1966, sold very well during 1966. Sales weren't too bad in 67, and then it fell flat. And it remained in the catalogue simply so that retailers could sell on their stock and get rid of it.
At about this time, Rovex dabbled in O-gauge, and the big train appeared, though not mentioned in Triang Hornby catalogues. This is one of the 1967 sets with the high mech and 2 wagons. It's referred to as a Triang product made by Rovex. This slightly larger set, with 2 more wagons, lasted until 1970. The Mark II type coaches are quite handsome, and because export sales were good, there was a Continental version. The sliding doors are cute, though the absence of glazing spoils things slightly. There were additional locomotives, both diesel and steam and rolling stock. These 2 wagons are quite rare. The idea was, of course, that the trains could be run both in the house and the garden, where they look quite realistic, though this one's not seen sunshine for a long time. The big train, later to be manufactured in Russia. Well, 1971 is on the horizon, and these 3 catalogues, all with Cuneo covers, will take us in that direction. The big commercial event is the formation of Triang Wrenn, based entirely on the Hornby 00 products. Pat Hammond gives the story.
Having taken over Meccano Limited, Lines had a problem to know what to do with the Hornby 00 tools. They were being pressured both by the public, who wanted Hornby 00 production to be restarted, and also by 1 or 2 companies who were interested in buying or leasing the tools from them, including Trix, incidentally. The problem carried on until one day George Wrenn, who managed G&R Wrenn Limited, which was a subsidiary company, was looking round the Meccano factory and came across the tools and asked if he could have them. We think that he had in mind that these were going to be marketed as Wrenn Railways, but it's quite clear that the instruction came that they had to be Triang Wrenn, and they would be marketed as an extension of the Triang Hornby range.
And indeed, they did appear in the 16th edition, but a page had sneaked in the previous year as Triang Hornby by Wrenn. This simple catalogue from 1970 shows the range including wagons. The locomotives were boxed in the style adopted by Wrenn for the entire company life until 1992, though there were a few crude ones, perhaps a box shortage. The instruction manuals also changed very little. The locomotives were identical to Hornby 00, apart from the couplings and the older liveries. You'll have spotted mallard in earlier sequences. This is a Triang Wrenn model, which used the plastic tender from Flying Scotsman, as Wrenn couldn't produce the original tin plate version. The wagon range became quite extensive and reflected a large number of private owners, though some were British Railways and identical to the Hornby 00 version. This is a slight oddity, a combination of Triang and Wrenn. Wrenn made the control unit and Triang supplied the locomotive. An odd accessory that was also intended for the Minic motorways. Rather strangely, you could also buy the control box separately. But what came out of Basildon was often a mystery.
Situation at Basildon was they had, by any modern standards, a relatively small factory, and they very much copied the East End practice, as I understand, of outworkers. And the times I would go down there, I'd see a lady with her children with maybe 2 or 3 prams loaded with components. They'd literally gone into the factory, collected these components, taken them back to their home, pressed them, assembled them, did whatever work they had to do on them, and then brought them back into the factory.
Just part of the Wrenn story. 1969 and 70 brought additional new rolling stock. Some new, others simply in alternative liveries. The splendid Coronation locomotive, quite an ambitious subject. As was this 75-ton crane, still in production today, released in 1971. Nigel Evans, retired project manager with Rovex, recalls how it started.
On a particular occasion, I remember having to go to Stratford East Depot to photograph the breakdown crane. And this was taken out of the shed and the whole unit arranged for us on a track. And the only way I could photograph the crane itself all in one piece was to climb a very tall, slender floodlighting pole with a ladder bolted to the side. And in fact I found that I couldn't get it all in one shot, and therefore we had to sellotape 2 pictures together to get the whole unit.
Nigel was similarly involved with the Evening Star locomotive. These are some of the photographs he took in 1970 when it was in store at Brighton. Evening Star represents the finest model to have come out of Margate between 1954 and 1971 and is a fitting locomotive to end our story. To confirm that, we took it to the Bluebell Railway to meet a full-size version. Colin Turner is a 9F driver and instructor on the line, and he admires the full-size version. It's easy to drive, powerful, responds well, and looks good. Qualities found in the Triang Hornby model, perhaps?
We can see some very good features here which represent the original, and one of them is the clearance underneath the boiler here. Another feature of these engines is the flangeless centre driver here, as you can see, which is exactly the same as the full-size engine. Another feature is the valve gear here, which is a pretty good representation of the Walshart's valve gear, and for the size of model I would say that that's pretty well proportioned.
So late 1971 saw the end of Triang Hornby. The catalogue from 1972 still carried the logo, but in name only. So our story began in 1951 with this modest catalogue and concludes at this point. The Hornby name continued, but that's another story. The Triang Railway story has been one of commitment to quality, an eye on price, an awareness of customer expectations, and above all, skilled company management. These factors brought the model railway hobby through a difficult 7 years, and the success of today's manufacturers is in part due to the survival of Triang Hornby.